This program is brought to you in part by the international law firm of Fulbright and Jaworski. Celebrating its 90th anniversary, Fulbright serves businesses from 16 locations, from Dallas to New York to London to Dubai to Beijing. When you think globally, think Fulbright. And the valued support of KERA members. Thank you.
He had a strong sense of social justice, a love for people, and along with that, he was just talented. You put all that together, you got a great judge.
Court is in session at this time for jury selection and trial.
The most important thing he accomplished was helping get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. And that's something that we perhaps take for granted too much, but was a remarkable contribution to American government.
Seems to me the judge was a man of great wisdom and understanding. The key for him was to make it a better school system. He cared about it. He really did care about this.
He was a man who taught us by his own example that you can and should make a contribution to make this system and this society better than you found it. And my gosh, did he ever leave it a whole lot better than he found it.
The late federal judge Barefoot Sanders left an indelible mark on all three branches of government. We talked in 2006 about his career. You'll see our conversation along with reflections from family, friends, and colleagues about his extraordinary life. You're a native Dallasite.
Right, right.
What do you remember about Dallas as a child? What was the city like back then?
We thought it was a big city. Of course, when you look back at it from now, it wasn't a big city. It's much quieter than it is. And, you know, for instance, I had no hesitation getting on the streetcar. My folks had no hesitation about my getting on the streetcar. We lived over on Abbott, and getting on the streetcar going out to the ball game.
He was kind of a country boy in some respects. I mean, he raised chickens in his backyard and sold the eggs.
He came up in the Depression, and so hard work was just a hallmark of that era.
My dad's parents did instill in him a strong sense of right and wrong that he, carried throughout his life and passed down to us.
His father, as an attorney, was also interested in politics. He headed up the campaign for Congress for Sarah T. Hughes, who later became a federal judge. And Barefoot worked on that campaign. And that was kind of the early seeds of getting directly involved in politics. And that came through his father.
Sarah T. Hughes was unsuccessful in her 1946 run for Congress, but she remained an important political ally for Barefoot, who had already grabbed the public spotlight as a young boy. I haven't met anybody who grew up in Dallas who doesn't have fond memories of the state fair. One in particular with you, though, you were Freckle King.
Oh, yeah.
Of the 1936 state fair.
Yeah, I remember very well.
How did that come about?
Well, they had announced in the paper they were going to have a contest for Freckle King and Freckle Queen. And so they did. I was the Freckle King, and I got to have an all-day date with the Freckle Queen.
And the way the king was selected was a count of the number of freckles that he had on his face, his nose, and his ears. They used a magnifying glass to examine and then count out loud the number of freckles. Well, okay, there are 340 on the nose. There are 75 on the left ear, whatever.
And well, his was numbered in the thousands. He was a clear winner.
The question I'm sure you get all the time, Barefoot,
yeah,
really is your name. It's your middle name.
It really is.
When people first met Barefoot, they instinctively looked down at his feet. Just to check.
That's my grandmother's maiden name. She was Miss Barefoot. It's an Anglo-Saxon name.
He had a sense of the politics of the name, and so when he went away to college, he started being called Barefoot. Before, in grade school, he was a little embarrassed by this unusual name. He went by HB.
I went down to the university and I ran for Yale leader. It helped politically, at least at the university. And you know, you go to a big school like the University of Texas in Austin, even in the 1940s, there were maybe 20,000 there, and it helps to be known with a distinctive name.
The name Barefoot became a wonderful asset to his career because when people heard it, they remembered it.
World War II interrupted Barefoot's time in college. He served 3 years in the Navy. When he returned to UT, Barefoot decided to run for student body president. He and his fraternity brothers orchestrated a memorable election day that led to victory.
He put those fraternity brothers to work, and they whitewashed barefoot prints all over the campus sidewalks. And to this day, people will talk to me about, oh, I was in school with your husband and saw all those barefoot prints. I'll never forget it. He used the barefoot imprint throughout his political career, and so it became his logo. We were married in 1952, in June, and we had a 5-day honeymoon that was wonderful. We came back and hit the ground running for the state legislature. It was a tough race because he took on part of the Dallas establishment, if he would. They came to him and said, well, son, why don't you just wait a few years before you run? And he decided, no, that he wanted to serve, and he wanted to go into public life if he could.
In 1953, Sanders began the first of 3 terms in the Texas House. He wrote or sponsored laws during that time that impact us today, among them a bill to clean up the Trinity River. Another bill helped shape the Texas Mental Health Code.
We had 3 children in rapid succession, and our 3 daughters, the son would come along a little bit later. And so they were really a part of the mix of family and politics from the get-go. And indeed, our 3rd daughter was born on election night of one of the state legislative races.
Your career moved very quickly, and by the early 60s, you became U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Texas, which also put you in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination.
I was part of the welcoming committee that day.
Working their way slowly, Judge Barefoot Sanders meeting the president, who gave him a pat on the shoulder.
And was in the procession. I must have been 7 or 8 cars back from the president, the vice president, White House cars, press cars, and so forth. And I didn't know really what had happened, except that something happened. I saw a policeman, we stopped, a policeman running with his gun drawn, and we speeded up. I could see the presidential car pulling ahead down Stemmons, very high rate of speed. No one was real sure, but they said that the president had been shot. They understood.
As the tragedy unfolded, Sanders received a call from the president's plane. Vice President Lyndon Johnson wanted U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes to swear him in as president. Sanders had the task of finding longtime family friend Hughes and the oath of office.
He called her at her home, and he told her that they didn't have the oath of office. And she said, don't worry about it. I've sworn in lots of people. I'll make it up. And by the time that she got out to Love Field, the staff had located it. And guess where it was? It was in the Constitution all the time. And so they had it for her, and she swore in the new president.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute.
In February of 1965, Sanders was tapped to be Assistant Deputy Attorney General. He would be a point man at the Justice Department for the ambitious Johnson agenda. The Sanders children were decidedly less enthusiastic, though, about the move to Washington.
The fateful day when we heard about it was on my father's birthday, February 5th, when we were having a family celebration, and he announced that, guess what, we're moving to Washington, and we're moving in 2 weeks. Well, we were stunned, because we didn't want to be leaving our friends and school, and I remember my two sisters and I got together that evening and felt like we could make a plan and have him change his mind. And we presented it. It didn't work. It was never going to work. But yeah, we did move that fast. We had literally, they packed everything, including the trash in the trash cans, to expedite our move to Washington.
Almost immediately after his arrival in Washington, Sanders was assigned to work on the historic Voting Rights Act of 1965.
When the Voting Rights Act was introduced, there was a lot of opposition to it. It was not legislation that was thought to be capable of being passed the year it was introduced. Barefoot was so very important in negotiating with all the members of Congress. If he found recalcitrant members, he would go to try to convince them. He would explain to them the importance of the legislation, why their fears were unfounded, why the provisions that they were apprehensive about were not ones to worry about. And obviously he was successful. The end result was he was able to get that legislation passed. The Voting Rights Act literally changed the political world in this country. Plainly and simply, changed the world. Prior to the time the Voting Rights Act was passed, various states had limitations or restrictions that made it difficult for people to register to vote, made it difficult for people to vote.
We must remember that one of the goals of the civil rights movement was to obtain the right to vote. I mean, that was very significant. That's why King was marching. The Selma March was to get that voter rights bill passed.
The Voting Rights Act started with the theory and the thesis that the right to vote is the most fundamental right there is in a political democracy in this country. And then what the Voting Rights Act said and did is we will not permit the states to put up barriers. We will not permit the states to put up restrictions to everybody having the opportunity to vote.
It was not only beneficial for black folk and Hispanics, it was beneficial for the whole nation. The nation is a better nation today because the doors were open for participation.
Certainly Lyndon Johnson gets credit for the passage of the Voting Rights Act and should get credit. But nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, was more integral to the passage of the Voting Rights Act than Barefoot Sanders.
Sanders left the Justice Department in 1967. Johnson had persuaded him to join the White House staff as legislative counsel for a challenging agenda in a turbulent political climate.
Well, the 1960s was a period of time that the youth of this country were unhappy and rebelling because of Vietnam, rebelling because of the draft. And people like Barefoot Sanders and Lyndon Johnson, in trying to get legislation passed for the overall benefit of all of the people of this country, had to do so with the backdrop of the unhappiness of an awful lot of people in this country. It was a scary time in Washington, but there was also exciting because of the potential of getting something beneficially done. It was exciting to be a part of what Lyndon Johnson was doing.
President Johnston, his heritage was a myriad of legislative accomplishments. I don't think anybody other than Roosevelt perhaps has been responsible for so much legislation.
Barefoot Sanders, in my judgment, had the most demanding job in the LBJ White House because he was working for the master legislator of all time. I don't think anybody else as the legislative council could have and would have accomplished with LBJ what Barefoot Sanders accomplished.
Sanders' hard work and loyalty did not go unnoticed. Johnson, in his final days as president, appointed Sanders as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia.
President Nixon had indicated to President Johnston that he would allow the last 5 appointments to go through the Congress. And on Inauguration Day, he pulled down Barefoot's name from one of those 5 appointments. Barefoot picked up his notebook and walked out of the White House and never looked back.
He would have been a great member of the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, and I think he was disappointed, but he surely made up for it.
The Sanders family returned to Dallas, but it wasn't long before Barefoot threw his hat in the political ring again, this time in a 1972 run for the United States Senate. The campaign was a family affair.
We first kind of started off as a whole family, and then Mom and Dad decided we could be more effective and canvass more territory if we split up. So we would hit the radio stations. Sometimes we had TV, but usually we were on the radio. And yes, we did get dubbed the Barefoot Bells, and I guess that was complimentary.
Barefoot's mother made a huge contribution by coming up with her idea of having barefoot-shaped cookies as a part of his campaign handouts. And so she had a welder to make this contraption to make 6 at a time of a sugar cookie recipe that she would, do it like that and then knock them out. And so every day during the campaign, she would get up in the morning and start on her cookie baking. It's just like the Barefoot stencils and when Barefoot ran at UT. The Barefoot cookie became a legend.
Sanders defeated Democrat Ralph Yarborough in the primary, but unseating Republican incumbent John Tower would be a long shot. Nixon's landslide victory over George McGovern in 1972 made it difficult for Democrats to capture the vote. Sanders lost his race for the Senate.
This wasn't the first time Barefoot had lost at the polls. He had lost in 1958 running for Congress against a seated Republican incumbent. And so it stiffened his back. He never was sorry that he didn't take the challenge, though.
Congress added more seats to the federal judiciary in 1979. The pieces now were in place for Sanders to be a federal judge. Senator Lloyd Bentsen recommended him, President Jimmy Carter appointed him, and on May 4th, 1979, Harold Barefoot Sanders, Jr. was sworn in as a United States District Judge for the Northern District of Texas.
He liked being a judge. He would have been down there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and a lot of weeks I know he was down there 7 days a week. He was down there on Christmas Day one year, and one of the guards says, "You're down here," and he wanted to check on something, so he had gone down to the courthouse that day. His family called him Bubba. I found this bumper sticker at a little cafe, and it had "Bubba likes it," and we had it up on the bench for many years that he could see that every time he went out on the bench that Bubba likes it.
His relationship with his clerks was a very close one. He described it one time as partly a professional relationship and partly a family relationship and partly a friendship.
Each year when the clerks would leave, they tried to come up with some gift for the judge.
One of his clerks decided to stage a mock trial with dogs in the roles of lawyers and jurors and judge.
They had a little black robe for one to put on the bench, and one in the witness box, and one is a court reporter, and it was very funny, and we do have the pictures, and the judge really liked that.
Because it really did reflect an awful lot about him. It was a combination of his love of animals, his love of the law, and of course, his good relationship with his clerks.
It's just been one large family. The judge always maintained a relationship with the clerks after they had finished their clerkship. One of the things the judge always asked the clerks when he would visit with them, not only what they were doing, but it was, and what have you done for your country lately? And they always had to be prepared because they knew that that question was coming.
Court is in session at this time for jury selection and trial in a civil case.
In Sanders' 27 years on the bench, a number of his cases were high profile. In particular, the cases involving the rights of the students in the state schools for the mentally retarded and the patients at the state hospitals for the mentally ill.
He was very strong for civil rights, but he really brought to the MHMR cases an understanding that even the powerless, helpless, invisible people in society had constitutional rights, and that it was the job of the courts to step in and protect those constitutional rights if the other political branches of government were unwilling to do so. And what he discovered when these lawsuits involving the mentally retarded and the mentally ill were filed was that the state institutions that were supposed to care for these people were really just warehouses. Calling them a hellhole would not be a great exaggeration. And he recognized that these folks may have been completely powerless as far as the political process was concerned, and largely invisible as far as politicians were concerned. And he recognized that it was his duty as the judge to make sure that their constitutional rights were protected. I think most people will remember Judge Sanders because of the school desegregation case in Dallas.
The case came before me in '81. Actually, it was filed in '70. Judge Taylor had it for a while. He got tired of it. So it was reassigned, and we actually drew names out of a hat. Everybody was quite nervous. No one was striking to get that case.
Why is that?
Well, it involved a lot of controversy, a good deal of work. It wasn't work so much, everybody's going to be working anyway, but the controversy and the heat that surrounded it at the time, no one really wanted that.
The major challenge that Barefoot had was the fact that it appeared we were not making any progress whatsoever. This case went on for years. There was great resistance to the implementation of the plan. No matter what orders the court gave, there were efforts to get around those orders, not to implement them. And you had people in the African-American community and Hispanic community were upset with that. You had people in the white community who were upset with it. It was the kind of thing that pleased nobody.
You said no to expanding busing.
Yeah, we didn't expand it.
Why?
We didn't need to, and I felt that we had the maximum attainable. That in 1985, I cut out a lot of the busing, and in 1986, I cut out a lot more of it. And the reason I did was because in running all the statistics, it showed that, and for instance, in South Dallas, a lot of the African-American children in South Dallas were being bused up into Northeast Dallas, and they were going to school with African-American children up there. Well, there was no point in doing that. And the same thing was going on over in Oak Cliff, over into Northwest Dallas. So that cut back significantly on the bus and took that out as a big issue.
It's been said that it took a long time to desegregate the schools. It didn't take a long time. It took time for the community to realize that it had to be done. Dallas was being forced to desegregate schools. They went through 4 judges. With Judge Sanders, they began to find the answer, and the answer was less busing but better education. The result is it lasted until 2003. By that time, Dallas was ready for it, and the result was that it was over. He knew that he couldn't close the gap completely between Hispanics, African Americans, and whites, but he was seeing notable improvement. He was seeing the community coming together, people working together and caring for their children.
He did a pretty remarkable job with that case, if you think about it, because there wasn't the sort of violence that afflicted other cities. And at the same time, there was this tremendous upside of magnet schools and innovative ways of desegregation that didn't depend on coercion, but really relied much more on enticing people to do the right thing because they could get a better education that way.
How do you hope people will remember your time on the bench?
I hope they would remember it for integrity, for a progressive attitude, for tolerance, and for a willingness to work with all sides, but hewing to a line of what I think is right and staying on that line.
During his 27 years on the bench, Barefoot Sanders also worked to ensure those qualities beyond his own courtroom. He served on the multi-district litigation panel and the judicial conference, both designed to promote efficient use of resources in the federal court system. He also was honored with numerous awards, including the Dallas Bar Association's Martin Luther King Jr. Justice Award, the Federal Bar Association's Sarah T. Hughes Civil Rights Award, and the Dallas CASA Champion of Children Award.
He was present for the public as a United States District Judge, personifying the rule of law, the rule of fairness. And I think that was a very important legacy that he left, an inspiration to other federal judges to follow in his footsteps.
Everywhere that he served, he was effective. And the community is better for that. The nation is better for that. And we're all grateful. And I think that'll be a part of his legacy.
For me, a trailblazer is someone who changes the path, changes the course, changes the direction. He changed the direction and the path of this state and this country for the better. Barefoot Sanders was a true trailblazer in this state.
To learn more about Barefoot Sanders, go to kera.org/trailblazer. This program is brought to you in part by the international law firm of Fulbright & Jaworski. Celebrating its 90th anniversary, Fulbright serves businesses from 16 locations, from Dallas to New York to London to Dubai to Beijing. When you think globally, think Fulbright. And by the valued support of KERA members. Thank you.